Hey guys, tonight we journey into the fascinating world of drug use in ancient Greece and Rome. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in ancient Greece with a pounding headache, aching joints, and a fever that makes even the gentle Mediterranean breeze feel offensive. Naturally, you decide to visit the nearest pharmacy. Unfortunately, the nearest pharmacy will not be invented for another couple of thousand years, so that plan falls apart almost immediately. Instead, you live in a world where medicine, religion, and superstition all share the same dinner table. If you become ill, your family might prepare a drink made from herbs gathered on a nearby hillside. If that doesn't work, they call for a physician. If the physician looks confused, which, to be fair, medicine was still very much figuring things out, someone suggests you've offended a god. Before long, you're swallowing an herbal remedy, sacrificing a goat, and promising Apollo you'll be a better person if he would kindly make the headache leave. Ancient healthcare believed strongly in covering every possible angle. As you wander through the bustling agora, the marketplace overflows with dried herbs, fragrant resins, oils, seeds, roots, flowers, and powders stored in clay jars. The air smells wonderfully earthy, although there is always the unsettling possibility that one of those pleasant aromas could also make you hallucinate for the next 12 hours. Every merchant confidently guarantees that his remedy has cured countless people. Every customer insists their grandmother makes something even better at home. Apparently, my grandmother's recipe is superior, has been part of human civilization for far longer than anyone suspected. Your world contains no chemistry laboratories, no clinical trials, and certainly no tiny instruction leaflet folded 17,000 times into a box. Instead, knowledge passes from teacher to student, healer to apprentice, parent to child. Everything depends on observation. Which leaf reduces pain? Which root calms a cough? Which flower helps someone sleep? More importantly, which innocent-looking plant causes your uncle to spend the afternoon arguing with an olive tree because he's become absolutely convinced it's judging him? The natural world is both your pharmacy and your greatest source of danger. Some plants genuinely ease suffering, others lower fevers, stop bleeding, or numb pain. Yet growing only a few steps away may be herbs capable of causing blindness, terrifying hallucinations, paralysis, or an extremely permanent cure for all earthly problems. Because of this, experienced healers earn enormous respect. They spend decades learning when each plant should be harvested, how it should be dried, what can safely be mixed together, and perhaps most importantly, what absolutely should not. Their profession requires remarkable memory, careful judgment, and the confidence to tell impatient patients that drinking 3 times the recommended amount will not make them recover 3 times faster. Human beings have apparently ignored dosage instructions since the invention of dosage instructions. As you begin exploring ancient Greece and Rome, one thing quickly becomes clear. Contrary to modern myths, these civilizations were not wandering around in a permanent cloud of intoxication. Powerful drugs certainly existed, but they were treated with surprising respect. The Greeks and Romans understood a lesson that modern medicine still repeats today. Almost every drug can heal, almost every drug can harm, and the difference often comes down to one very boring concept that humans have spent thousands of years enthusiastically ignoring: moderation. As you continue your journey through the ancient Mediterranean, one plant begins appearing almost everywhere you look. It grows quietly in cultivated fields, its pale flowers swaying gently in the breeze, before giving way to round seed pods. At first glance it seems harmless enough, beautiful even. But inside those pods lies one of the most powerful natural medicines humanity has ever discovered, the opium poppy. Thousands of years before chemists isolated morphine, Greeks and Romans had already learned that the milky sap collected from these poppies possessed remarkable properties. It could dull pain, calm violent coughing fits, reduce severe diarrhea, and help exhausted patients finally drift into sleep. In an age without anesthesia, antibiotics, or modern painkillers, this little flower was nothing short of extraordinary. If you visit the workshop of an experienced physician, you'll likely find dried poppy preparations stored alongside dozens of other medicinal ingredients. The doctor doesn't hand them out casually. Unlike the local merchant who insists his mystery potion can cure baldness, arthritis, and an unhappy marriage all at once, trained physicians know this plant deserves respect. That doesn't mean everyone uses it perfectly, of course. Human beings have always possessed the remarkable talent of hearing "use sparingly" and translating it into perhaps twice as much will work twice as well. Medical writers like Hippocrates describe opium as a valuable medicine, while later physicians such as Galen discuss its benefits in even greater detail. But they also understand that larger doses become dangerous. Too much can slow breathing, leave a patient unconscious, or prove fatal. They may not know exactly how the nervous system functions, but centuries of observation have taught them an important lesson. If your patient stops breathing, you've probably overdone it. You might expect wealthy Romans to indulge in opium recreationally at lavish banquets, but historical evidence suggests widespread recreational use was surprisingly uncommon. Opium remained primarily a medicine, rather than an everyday luxury. It was expensive, carefully prepared, and usually administered for specific illnesses instead of casual amusement. For soldiers returning from battle with shattered bones or deep sword wounds, however, the poppy could feel almost miraculous. A physician cleaning an injury might offer a carefully measured preparation to reduce agony before beginning treatment. It wouldn't remove the pain completely, but in a world where surgery often involved sharp knives and tremendous courage, even partial relief was worth its weight in silver. The humble poppy reminds you that ancient medicine was filled with contradictions. The very same plant capable of easing unbearable suffering could also become deadly in careless hands. The Greeks and Romans understood this balance surprisingly well. They didn't see powerful drugs as magical cures or forbidden poisons. They saw them as tools, extraordinarily useful ones, that demanded knowledge, discipline, and perhaps the occasional reminder not to let your cousin prepare the dosage after his third cup of wine. As you spend more time in ancient Greece and Rome, you begin to notice something unexpected. The most respected physicians are not wandering around promising miracle cures or claiming they've discovered one strange herb that solves every problem known to humanity. Quite the opposite. The best doctors are often the most cautious. You step into the practice of Hippocrates, the physician whose name still echoes through medicine today. He believes illness has natural causes rather than being solely the punishment of angry gods. This is a remarkably bold idea in the 5th century before Christ. While many people still seek divine intervention, Hippocrates insists that careful observation matters just as much as prayer. Instead of immediately reaching for the strongest remedy available, he asks questions. How long have you been ill? What have you eaten? How well have you slept? Does the pain worsen after exercise? You were hoping for a magical potion, but instead you've accidentally become part of one of history's earliest medical interviews. Centuries later, the Roman physician Galen expands this approach even further. His medical texts become so influential that doctors will continue studying them for well over 1,000 years. Galen carefully records hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products that might help treat different conditions. Some of his conclusions prove surprisingly accurate. Others, age somewhat less gracefully. Ancient medicine occasionally wandered into territory where confidence exceeded evidence by a comfortable margin. For both physicians, however, drugs are only one part of treatment. They often prescribe changes in diet, exercise, sleep, bathing, and fresh air before reaching for stronger remedies. Sometimes the best medicine is simply eating better and getting enough rest. Admittedly, that recommendation has never sold particularly well throughout history. When stronger substances become necessary, dosage matters enormously. A physician preparing opium or mandrake does not simply scoop out a generous handful while saying, "That looks about right." At least, not if he hopes to keep his reputation. Experienced doctors understand that every powerful medicine exists on a narrow line between healing and harm. Their patients, unfortunately, do not always make life easy. Some insist on doubling their medicine because they feel impatient. Others stop treatment the moment they feel slightly better. A few ignore every instruction entirely before returning several days later, wondering why nothing improved. You begin to suspect physicians have been quietly sighing at their patients since the invention of patience. The greatest lesson these ancient doctors leave behind is not any single remedy, but a way of thinking. Observe carefully. Record everything. Respect powerful drugs. Never assume more is automatically better. It is wisdom earned through centuries of experience and advice that remains surprisingly difficult for humanity to follow. By now, you've probably noticed that wine appears almost everywhere you go. It sits on breakfast tables, accompanies business meetings, flows during religious festivals, and somehow finds its way into nearly every respectable dinner. If ancient Greece and Rome had a universal beverage, this was it. But before you picture endless scenes of cheerful drunkenness, there's an important detail that surprises most modern visitors. Almost nobody drinks it straight. To your amazement, pouring unmixed wine into a cup immediately earns a few raised eyebrows. At a Greek symposium, a gathering where wealthy men debate philosophy, politics, poetry, and occasionally whose beard looks the most distinguished, the wine is carefully diluted with water inside a large mixing bowl called a crater. Drinking it undiluted is considered uncivilized. That's something barbarians supposedly do. The Greeks pride themselves on moderation, self-control, and reason. Of course, after the seventh cup, those philosophical discussions occasionally become considerably less reasonable, but it's the principle that matters. You quickly discover that wine serves purposes far beyond simple recreation. Since clean drinking water isn't always reliable, diluted wine often becomes the safer choice. The alcohol helps reduce bacteria, making everyday meals a little less adventurous from a digestive standpoint. Physicians also prescribe wine regularly. Depending on what troubles you, they might recommend sweet wine, aged wine, diluted wine, warmed wine, or wine infused with herbs. Sometimes they mix it with honey, spices, resin, or medicinal plants. In other words, the ancient doctor is essentially preparing a cocktail, but one intended to cure your cough rather than encourage questionable dancing. Some remedies taste surprisingly pleasant. Others taste like someone accidentally seasoned grape juice with an entire garden. The Romans become particularly creative. Wealthy households store expensive wines from every corner of the empire. Certain vintages age for decades and become symbols of status. Serving an old vintage at dinner tells your guests you've done very well for yourself. Serving vinegar by accident tells them you've probably fired the wrong servant. At lavish banquets, however, moderation occasionally takes a holiday. Elite guests spend hours eating, drinking, listening to musicians, watching entertainers, and discussing politics. Some hosts quietly add herbs believed to improve digestion or reduce hangovers. Others simply trust that tomorrow's headache is tomorrow's problem. Not everyone approves. Philosophers like Seneca frequently criticize excessive drinking. Losing control, they argue, means surrendering the very thing that separates humans from animals: reason. As you leave another evening feast, you begin to appreciate wine's remarkable role in ancient society. It is medicine, ritual, hospitality, commerce, celebration, and daily nourishment all poured into the same cup. The Greeks and Romans respected it deeply, while simultaneously proving that even civilizations famous for moderation occasionally needed someone to say, "Perhaps you've had enough for tonight." As you continue exploring the ancient Mediterranean, you eventually encounter another plant that sparks endless modern curiosity: cannabis. Today, the very mention of it tends to launch debates that somehow become louder than Roman chariot races. In the ancient world, however, people generally viewed it with far less drama. To the Greeks and Romans, cannabis is simply one useful plant among many. Its strongest reputation isn't actually as a drug. It's as a remarkably practical crop. Walk through any busy port, and you'll see ships preparing for voyages across the Mediterranean. Their thick ropes, sturdy sails, fishing nets and rigging often rely on hemp fibres. Without them, merchants don't trade, fishermen don't fish, and Roman tax collectors become very unhappy, because fewer ships mean fewer taxes. Nothing motivates an empire quite like protecting its revenue. Yet physicians also know the plant has medicinal qualities. Medical writers occasionally describe preparations made from cannabis seeds or extracts for relieving certain types of pain, reducing inflammation, or treating ear discomfort. The prescriptions are surprisingly specific. Ancient doctors generally aren't telling patients to consume large quantities and then spend the afternoon contemplating whether Plato's cave is actually someone's basement. Instead, cannabis remains one relatively modest tool inside an enormous medical cabinet. This surprises many modern readers. Unlike opium, which receives detailed attention from physicians, cannabis appears far less frequently in surviving Greek and Roman medical texts. That doesn't mean it was unknown. It simply wasn't considered one of medicine's greatest miracles. The Romans, practical as ever, admire plants that serve multiple purposes. A single crop can produce fibres for clothing, rope strong enough to anchor ships, oil from the seeds, animal feed, and occasionally medicinal preparations. Efficiency like that would make even the most organised Roman administrator smile, which historians agree was an exceptionally rare event. As always, dosage remains important. Ancient physicians understand that nearly every medicinal plant behaves differently depending on how it's prepared. A carefully measured remedy differs enormously from random experimentation. Fortunately, most doctors prefer the first option, largely because repeat customers are considerably easier to obtain when they survive. The philosophers, meanwhile, show remarkably little interest in recreational intoxication through cannabis. Their writings devote far more attention to wine, self-control, ethics, and the pursuit of wisdom. Then again, spending several hours arguing over the definition of virtue may have provided enough altered mental states for one afternoon. By the time you leave Greece and Rome behind, one pattern has become unmistakable. Ancient societies rarely divided plants into simple categories like medicine or drug. A useful plant could heal the sick, build a ship, feed livestock, produce oil, and serve countless everyday needs all at once. To them, nature wasn't organised into neat little boxes. It was one enormous pharmacy, hardware store, grocery market, and occasionally poison cabinet, all growing in the same field. As you wander farther into the hills and forests of ancient Greece and Rome, you begin to realise that not every medicinal plant wears a friendly face. Some look beautiful, some smell pleasant, and some possess the remarkable ability to solve your headache by ensuring you never experience another one. Welcome to the world of mandrake, henbane, belladonna, and other plants that ancient physicians handled with extreme care. Mandrake is perhaps the most famous of them all. Its thick, forked root often resembles the rough shape of a human body, and that resemblance gives birth to countless legends. People whisper that the plant screams when pulled from the ground, killing anyone foolish enough to hear it. Others insist you should tie the plant to a dog, stand at a safe distance, and let the unfortunate animal do the harvesting. It's an entertaining story. It's also a convenient way to avoid doing the dangerous job yourself. The truth is far less magical, but no less impressive. Mandrake contains compounds capable of producing drowsiness, reducing pain, and sometimes sending people into deep sleep. Ancient physicians occasionally use it before surgery, or to calm patients suffering severe discomfort. Unfortunately, the distance between comfortably asleep and permanently asleep is not always very large, which is why experienced doctors measure carefully. Very carefully. Henbane presents another challenge. This unassuming plant can produce hallucinations, confusion, blurred vision, and memory loss. In tiny, carefully prepared amounts, it may ease pain or muscle spasms. In larger doses, your conversation with the household cat may become surprisingly philosophical, despite the fact that your household does not actually own a cat. Belladonna is equally dangerous. Although later generations become fascinated with its cosmetic uses, ancient healers know it primarily as a powerful medicinal and poisonous plant. Mishandling it carries serious consequences. Because of these risks, knowledge becomes priceless. An apprentice physician spends years learning how to recognize each leaf, flower, root, and seed. Two plants may look remarkably similar while producing completely opposite effects. One eases your stomach pain. The other introduces you to your ancestors considerably earlier than expected. Ancient medical texts repeatedly warn physicians to prepare these remedies with precision. Guesswork has no place here. Unlike adding extra garlic to dinner, adding a little more mandrake rarely improves the final result. As you leave another physician's workshop, one thing becomes wonderfully clear. Ancient medicine was never simply a collection of folk remedies and lucky guesses. It demanded observation, discipline, and generations of accumulated experience. The Greeks and Romans understood that nature offered extraordinary medicines, but she also had a wicked sense of humour, often placing the cure and the poison side by side and quietly waiting to see whether you knew the difference. As you leave behind physicians and herbalists, you enter an entirely different world, one where powerful substances are no longer taken to heal the body, but perhaps to transform the soul. The Greeks draw a careful line between medicine and religion, yet the two often cross paths in fascinating ways. If a doctor gives you a preparation to ease pain, no one thinks much of it. But if a priest hands you a mysterious drink inside one of Greece's holiest ceremonies, suddenly everyone becomes remarkably secretive, especially because revealing what happened could get you into serious trouble. For nearly 2,000 years, the Eleusinian Mysteries stand among the most sacred religious ceremonies in the Greek world. Every year, thousands of initiates travel to Eleusis, just outside Athens, hoping to participate in rituals dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. Kings attend, generals attend, philosophers attend. Even ordinary farmers save money for years just to experience the ceremony once in their lifetime. And yet, despite all these participants, almost nobody tells future generations exactly what happened inside. The initiates swear an oath of secrecy. Remarkably, they keep it. This may be one of history's greatest examples of people successfully keeping a secret. Modern group chats could never. The ceremony promises participants a deeper understanding of life, death, and what awaits beyond the grave. Ancient writers describe the experience as profoundly moving, sometimes life-changing. Many emerge convinced they no longer fear death. Naturally, historians begin asking questions. what exactly produced such powerful experiences? One theory suggests that participants drank a sacred beverage called kykeon. Ancient sources describe it as a mixture of water, barley, and mint. Simple enough, or perhaps not. Some modern scholars believe the barley may occasionally have been infected by ergot, a fungus containing naturally occurring compounds chemically related to substances discovered thousands of years later. If prepared under very specific conditions, the drink might have produced altered states of consciousness. It is an intriguing theory. It is also impossible to prove. Other historians argue the experience required no hidden drug at all. Imagine fasting for several days, walking miles in a religious procession, entering enormous torch-lit halls after sunset, hearing sacred hymns echo through the darkness, and witnessing ceremonies you've anticipated for years. Your mind hardly needs chemical encouragement to become overwhelmed. The truth is, we simply don't know. And perhaps that's fitting. The mysteries survive for nearly 2 millennia precisely because they remain mysterious. As you leave Eleusis under the quiet glow of the stars, you realize something profound. The Greeks were not always searching for intoxication itself. Often they were searching for meaning. If a sacred drink played any role, it was never the destination. It was merely one small step toward understanding mysteries they believed stretched far beyond the limits of ordinary human experience. As your journey continues, you eventually arrive at the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where one of the most famous women in the ancient world waits inside the Temple of Apollo. She is known simply as the Pythia, the Oracle of Delphi. Kings consult her before declaring war. Colonists seek her blessing before founding new cities. Merchants ask about fortunes. Generals trust her advice with thousands of lives. Considering her success rate, she somehow becomes history's most influential person, whose answers frequently require a second opinion. The sanctuary itself feels unlike anywhere you've visited. Pilgrims climb the sacred way carrying offerings of gold, silver, fine pottery, and statues dedicated to Apollo. Every city-state wants the god's favour, and every visitor hopes to leave with an answer. Whether they'll actually understand that answer is another matter entirely. Before approaching the oracle, priests perform purification rituals. Sacrifices are made. Sacred spring water is used for cleansing. Nothing happens casually here. Every step follows traditions that have been refined over centuries. Finally, the Pythia enters the inner chamber of the temple. Ancient writers describe her sitting upon a sacred tripod above a narrow opening in the earth. Soon afterward, she begins speaking. Sometimes her words are calm, sometimes they seem fragmented, sometimes they sound like poetry, and almost never do they provide the straightforward answer everyone hoped for. Ask whether you should invade a neighbouring kingdom, and instead of hearing yes or no, you might receive something like, "A great empire shall fall." Wonderful. The only small detail left unresolved is whose empire. For centuries, people accept that Apollo himself speaks through the oracle, but modern historians and scientists have wondered whether something else contributed to her unusual state. As you leave the military camps behind, you arrive somewhere that looks considerably more peaceful. At first, the stadium is already filling with spectators. Vendors shout over one another, athletes stretch beside the track, and trainers bark instructions with the same intensity modern coaches reserve for people who forgot leg day. Today is competition day, and just like athletes throughout history, everyone here wants the same thing: to win. Preferably without having to admit how difficult that actually is. The Olympic Games, along with countless regional competitions across Greece, reward more than just glory. Victorious athletes earn money, free meals, political influence, public statues, and enough local fame that your hometown may spend centuries mentioning your victory to anyone willing or unwilling to listen. Naturally, that creates pressure. Enormous pressure. You might assume ancient competitors searched for magical performance-enhancing drugs. The reality is both more interesting and considerably less dramatic. Most athletes focus obsessively on diet. Trainers prescribe carefully planned meals, rich in cheese, bread, figs, and eventually large quantities of meat. Earlier Greek athletes often rely heavily on plant-based diets, but by the classical period many competitors believe meat provides additional strength. Whether it actually transforms someone into an unbeatable champion remains open to debate. It certainly makes butchers very happy. Beyond food, athletes consume herbal preparations believed to improve stamina, reduce fatigue, or aid recovery after brutal training sessions. Some physicians recommend stimulating plants, while others prescribe restorative tonics following competition. Modern science would probably classify many of these remedies somewhere between possibly helpful and thank you for participating. Massage also becomes an essential part of athletic preparation. Before every event, your body is covered in olive oil and vigorously rubbed by attendants. The oil protects the skin, warms the muscles, and helps loosen stiff joints. Afterwards, dirt, sweat, and oil are scraped away using a curved bronze tool called a strigil. It is surprisingly effective. It is also one of history's least glamorous spa treatments. Pain remains a constant companion. Sprained ankles, torn muscles, bruised ribs, and fractured fingers are common. Physicians treat these injuries with herbal poultices, bandages, wine, and occasionally stronger medicines like opium when the pain becomes severe. Not to make athletes perform better, simply to help them recover, the Greeks place enormous value on fair competition. Victory is supposed to demonstrate excellence, discipline, and favour from the gods, not clever chemistry. Athletes caught cheating through bribery or deception face public disgrace, heavy fines and statues erected to remind everyone exactly what happens when ambition outruns integrity. As you watch another race begin, you realise something hasn't changed in over 2,000 years. Athletes still search for better training methods, better diets, faster recovery, and every legal advantage they can find. The equipment has evolved, the stadiums have grown larger, and the shoes have become significantly more comfortable. But the desire to shave one more second off the clock remains just as powerful as it was beneath the Greek sun. As the sun begins to set over Rome, you receive an invitation that most people would never refuse. A wealthy senator is hosting a banquet. You arrive at a sprawling villa where servants hurry through marble corridors carrying silver platters, imported wines, exotic spices, and enough food to feed a small village. Outside, fountains sparkle beneath torchlight. Inside, guests recline on luxurious couches, pretending they haven't been competing to display their wealth since the moment they walked through the front door. Ancient Roman banquets are about much more than eating. They are performances. Every dish announces the host's fortune. Every imported ingredient advertises his connections. Every expensive wine quietly whispers, "Look how successful I've become." The whisper, admittedly, is quite loud. Wine flows continuously throughout the evening, but unlike the Greeks, many Romans, especially during the imperial period, become increasingly comfortable drinking stronger mixtures. Servants constantly refill cups, while musicians play softly in the background, and entertainers perform between courses. Conversation shifts from politics to philosophy, from military victories to scandalous gossip. Some subjects have clearly survived every civilization. As the evening stretches on, physicians occasionally recommend herbal mixtures designed to aid digestion after enormous meals. Mint, fennel, anise, cumin, coriander, and countless other herbs appear both in the food and in medicinal drinks. Some guests even believe certain plants can reduce drunkenness or prevent tomorrow's headache. Modern science would politely describe those claims as optimistic. If hangover cures actually worked as advertised, humanity would have solved that particular problem sometime around the reign of Augustus. The wealthiest Romans sometimes experiment with stronger herbal preparations believed to promote relaxation, improve sleep, or relieve the discomfort caused by excessive eating and drinking. These remedies usually come from physicians rather than party guests, for good reason. Taking medical advice from the man currently singing at a statue is rarely considered best practice. Roman writers often criticize these extravagant feasts. Philosophers like Seneca argue that luxury has become an addiction of its own. He mocks guests who eat far beyond hunger simply because another expensive course appears before them. According to him, many wealthy Romans are no longer dining for nourishment, but competing in an endless contest of excess. Not everyone approves of these lavish displays. Many ordinary Romans will never experience such luxury. Their meals remain simple: bread, olives, vegetables, cheese, and occasionally fish or meat. The legendary banquets belong almost entirely to society's elite, making them far less common than modern imagination sometimes suggests. As you quietly leave the villa long after midnight, servants are still clearing dishes while exhausted musicians finish their final songs. You realize the greatest intoxication on display wasn't always caused by wine or herbal remedies. Sometimes it was wealth itself. And just like every other powerful substance you've encountered in the ancient world, too much of it often left people making decisions they would probably regret by sunrise. As you've travelled through Greece and Rome, you've encountered opium, wine, mandrake, cannabis, and countless medicinal herbs. By now, you may be wondering something that seems almost unavoidable. Did people become addicted? The short answer is yes. The longer answer is considerably more interesting. The Greeks and Romans didn't have modern medical terms like substance use disorder or detailed neurological theories about addiction. They knew nothing about dopamine receptors or brain chemistry, but they didn't need microscopes to recognize when someone could no longer control themselves. They simply watched. And people, as it turns out, have always been remarkably predictable. A man who could no longer finish a meal without several cups of wine. A patient who insisted on taking stronger and stronger doses of opium. A wealthy aristocrat whose entire daily routine revolved around pleasure rather than responsibility. The ancients noticed these patterns just as easily as we would today. Greek philosophers were especially fascinated by self-control. Plato and Aristotle argued that reason should govern desire, not the other way around. According to them, every person contained competing impulses. Wisdom meant allowing your rational mind to remain firmly in charge. Easier said than done. It still is. The Stoics took this idea even further. Philosophers like Epictetus and Seneca believed true freedom came from mastering your own desires. If you needed wine to feel happy, they argued, then wine had quietly become your master. That must have made dinner parties slightly awkward. Would you care for another cup? No, thank you. I'm currently practicing complete independence from worldly pleasures. Very well. More for everyone else. Roman physicians made similar observations from a medical perspective. Galen warned that medicines should never become daily comforts without necessity. A drug powerful enough to heal could also create dependence if used carelessly. Physicians therefore emphasized moderation, careful dosing, and stopping treatment once recovery had begun. Whether patients actually followed those instructions was another question entirely. Some undoubtedly did. Others probably heard, "Take 1 dose before bed," and interpreted it as, "Take 3 whenever convenient." Human creativity has always flourished around medical advice. Even Roman law occasionally reflected concerns about intoxication, public drunkenness, disorderly behavior, and loss of self-control were hardly admired qualities, particularly among members of the political elite. A senator staggering through the forum after too much wine inspired considerably less confidence than one who could at least remain upright during speeches. As you continue your journey, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The Greeks and Romans rarely viewed intoxication itself as the greatest danger. Losing mastery over yourself, that was the real problem. To them, the strongest chains were not always made of iron. Sometimes they were made of habits so comfortable that you no longer noticed you were wearing them. The deeper you explore the ancient world, the more you realize that every remarkable medicine has a sinister twin. A plant that eases pain can also stop a heart. A drink that helps someone sleep can ensure they never wake up. The difference, as physicians like to remind their students, is usually the dosage. The difference, as professional poisoners preferred to demonstrate, was often the intention. In ancient Greece and Rome, poisoning becomes one of history's most feared methods of murder. Unlike a sword, poison requires no battlefield, no physical strength, and no dramatic confrontation. It simply asks for patience, and perhaps a trustworthy dinner invitation. You quickly learn never to become too excited when someone insists they've prepared your favourite wine, especially if they also happen to inherit your estate. The Romans become particularly fascinated by poisons. As political rivalries grow more vicious during the late Republic and the Empire, rumours of secret poisoning spread through aristocratic society almost constantly. Some accusations are undoubtedly exaggerated, while others appear to have been frighteningly real. Every unexpected death seems to produce the same question. Was it illness? Or was someone simply very good at chemistry before chemistry officially existed? Professional poisoners gain an almost legendary reputation. Wealthy families sometimes employ experts capable of preparing deadly mixtures from seemingly ordinary plants. Hemlock, aconite, yew, belladonna, and concentrated preparations of other toxic herbs all become feared ingredients. Most respectable physicians refuse to have anything to do with such practices. Unfortunately, not everyone offering medical knowledge is respectable. One particularly infamous figure is Locusta, who lives during the reign of Emperor Nero. She becomes so well known for preparing poisons that ancient historians describe her almost like a state-sponsored specialist. According to several accounts, Nero himself relies upon her expertise during political assassinations. Having official imperial poisoner on your resume is certainly memorable. It probably makes networking events rather uncomfortable. The constant fear of poisoning changes everyday behaviour among Rome's elite. Wealthy households increasingly rely on trusted servants to prepare meals. Some powerful individuals even employ food tasters whose entire profession revolves around answering one important question. Will this kill the emperor? It is not a career with an especially generous retirement plan. Ironically, physicians studying antidotes help advance medical knowledge. They carefully observe symptoms caused by different poisons and experiment with treatments. Some even develop complex antidote mixtures, hoping one remedy might protect against multiple toxins. Most prove only partially effective. After all, medicine is difficult enough when your patient accidentally becomes ill. It becomes considerably harder when someone has deliberately tried to make sure they don't recover. As you leave the dangerous world of ancient poisons behind, one lesson stands above all the others. Nature itself was never good or evil. The same fields that produced life-saving medicines also produced deadly toxins. In the end, the greatest danger was rarely the plant growing in the hillside. It was the human hand that decided how to use it. By now you've wandered through temples, military hospitals, physicians' workshops, aristocratic banquets, and even the mysterious halls of Eleusis. Along the way you've encountered opium, cannabis, mandrake, wine, henbane, and enough medicinal herbs to make a modern botanical garden feel slightly underprepared. So here's the question. Were ancient Greece and Rome societies filled with people constantly looking for their next intoxicating experience? Not even close. In fact, one of the biggest misconceptions about the ancient world comes from looking at a few fascinating stories and assuming everyone behaved that way. It's a bit like finding one modern billionaire who owns a private island and concluding that the average person commutes to work by helicopter. History rarely works like that. The overwhelming majority of Greeks and Romans spent their days farming, fishing, building roads, raising children, tending livestock, paying taxes, repairing roofs, arguing with neighbours, and hoping next year's harvest wouldn't be ruined by drought. Exciting? Not always. Historically accurate? Very much so. Most ordinary people simply didn't have regular access to expensive medicinal drugs. Opium preparations were valuable. Exotic herbs often cost money. Physicians themselves weren't available in every village, and when they were, their services weren't always cheap. If you developed a headache after working 12 hours in the fields, there was a good chance the prescribed treatment would be get some rest. Not because your doctor lacked imagination, because tomorrow you still had to work 12 hours in the fields. Ancient writers also make it clear that moderation was considered a virtue. Philosophers praised self-control. Physicians warned against excessive use of medicines. Religious ceremonies surrounded powerful substances with strict rituals rather than casual consumption. Even wine, the most common intoxicant in both civilizations, came with social expectations. Drink moderately. Maintain your dignity. Don't embarrass yourself. Simple advice. Remarkably difficult for certain dinner guests. Hollywood and popular novels often portray Roman banquets as endless scenes of wild intoxication, while Greek philosophers are sometimes imagined wandering around in permanent mystical trances. Reality is considerably less dramatic. The famous banquets belonged mostly to wealthy elites. The sacred mysteries involved only specific religious festivals. Medical drugs were generally administered by trained healers for practical purposes. For everyone else, life remained wonderfully ordinary. They worried about crops, weather, taxes, marriage, aging parents, difficult landlords, and whether their donkey would decide today was another excellent opportunity to stop walking halfway home. Some problems truly are timeless. As you look back across the ancient Mediterranean, you begin to appreciate how disciplined these societies often were regarding powerful substances. They certainly possessed drugs capable of easing pain, inducing sleep, or altering consciousness. But unlike many modern myths suggest, they rarely celebrated intoxication for its own sake. More often than not, they respected these substances because they understood a simple truth. The most powerful medicines deserved the greatest caution, and wisdom wasn't found in escaping reality. It was found in knowing when not to. As your journey through ancient Greece and Rome comes to an end, you might expect to walk away with a list of strange plants, mysterious potions, and colourful stories about philosophers accidentally drinking the wrong herbal mixture. Instead, you leave with something much more surprising. The ancients understood that drugs were never really the story. People were. For thousands of years, human beings have searched for relief from pain, comfort during illness, courage before surgery, restful sleep after exhausting days, and hope when medicine offered very little certainty. Those desires haven't changed. Only the labels on the bottles have. You think back to the physician carefully measuring opium before handing it to a wounded soldier. He wasn't trying to create pleasure. He was trying to make unbearable pain slightly more bearable. You remember the herbalist spending years learning which root healed and which one killed. Knowledge mattered, because mistakes had consequences. You remember the priests at Eleusis reminding you that people have always searched for experiences larger than themselves. You remember the philosophers who spent far less time asking, "What can this substance do?" than asking, "What will it do to the person who uses it?" That distinction mattered. It still does. Perhaps the greatest surprise is how cautious these civilizations often were. Modern imagination sometimes pictures the ancient world as reckless and primitive, with people swallowing mysterious potions simply because someone pointed at a shrub and said, "Trust me." The historical reality is almost the opposite. The best physicians emphasized moderation. The best philosophers praised self-control. The best healers respected nature enough to fear it. They understood that the strongest medicines demanded the greatest responsibility. It's advice that somehow remains fresh after 2,000 years. As the Roman Empire rose and eventually fell, countless medical texts survived because later civilizations recognized their value. Medieval monks copied them by hand. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded them. Renaissance physicians studied them once again. The knowledge travelled much farther than the empires themselves. Empires disappear. Good ideas have a habit of surviving. As you take one final look across the ancient Mediterranean, the temples, vineyards, hospitals, marketplaces, and quiet hillsides begin to fade into history. What remains is a remarkably familiar picture. People caring for loved ones, doctors doing their best with the knowledge available, patients hoping tomorrow would hurt a little less than today, and ordinary men and women searching, just as we still do, for a healthier, longer, and more peaceful life. History often reminds us that humanity changes far less than we like to believe. Our medicines have become more sophisticated, our understanding of the body has grown immeasurably deeper, and our pharmacies are thankfully better organised than a sack full of dried roots. But the questions remain the same. How do we ease suffering? How do we live well? And perhaps most importantly, how do we use powerful tools wisely? Those are questions the Greeks and Romans asked every bit as earnestly as we do today. And in many ways we're still searching for the same answers. The streets of Rome never truly sleep. Before the sun has even climbed above the tiled rooftops, the city is already roaring to life. Bakers fire their ovens, donkeys pull wagons piled high with grain, merchants argue over prices before breakfast, and somewhere nearby, a blacksmith has decided that dawn is the perfect time to remind everyone that iron is, in fact, very loud. If you happen to be one of Rome's wealthiest citizens, you might be wondering why you paid a fortune for a magnificent townhouse only to wake each morning feeling as though you live inside a construction project that occasionally catches fire. By the 1st century after Christ, Rome had become the largest city in the Mediterranean world. Historians estimate that nearly 1 million people crowded into its neighbourhoods. Elegant marble temples stood beside narrow alleyways. Grand public buildings overlooked towering apartment blocks called insulae, where countless ordinary Romans lived packed together several stories high. Wealth flowed through the city like nowhere else on earth, but so did noise, dust, and endless commotion. The city itself was astonishing, yet living there could test anyone's patience. During daylight hours, many heavy wagons were forbidden from entering the busiest streets, so deliveries often took place after dark. Just as you drifted towards sleep, wooden wheels rattled across ancient paving stones, while mule drivers shouted at one another beneath your bedroom window. The satirist Juvenal joked that only the very wealthy could hope for decent sleep in Rome, and even they were not guaranteed much peace. Then summer arrived. The narrow streets trapped heat between brick and stone buildings, turning entire districts into ovens long after sunset. Smoke drifted from thousands of kitchens, bathhouses, workshops and furnaces. Public latrines, fish markets, livestock, open drains, and overcrowded neighbourhoods combined to produce an atmosphere that was unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. fresh sea air began sounding less like a luxury and more like a miracle. Of course, rich Romans enjoyed comforts beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. Their homes often featured shaded courtyards, elegant fountains, colourful frescoes, polished marble floors, and private dining rooms. Yet none of those expensive decorations could silence shouting neighbours, political demonstrations, wandering musicians, barking dogs, or the determined rooster who seemed convinced that dawn began whenever he felt inspired. Life at the top also came with constant obligations. Senators attended endless meetings. Wealthy patrons greeted clients every morning before sunrise. Friends expected invitations, rivals watched every public appearance, and gossip spread through Rome faster than wildfire. Success meant living under permanent observation. Every dinner, every conversation, and every decision became part of your public reputation. Eventually, many members of Rome's elite reached the same conclusion. If wealth was supposed to bring comfort, why remain surrounded by endless crowds, unbearable heat, and constant demands? The answer waited beyond the city walls. Along Italy's glittering coastline stood magnificent villas overlooking calm blue waters, where sea breezes replaced smoke, waves replaced wagon wheels, and mornings began with birds instead of arguments. Rome remained the centre of power, but for those fortunate enough to afford it, true luxury increasingly meant escaping the capital whenever possible. For the richest Romans, leaving the city behind was never about abandoning Rome. It was about finally enjoying everything their success had earned. Once the decision to escape Rome had been made, another question followed almost immediately. Where should a wealthy Roman disappear to? The answer, for many, was simple. Somewhere the sea sparkled, the air smelled of salt instead of smoke, and the journey was short enough that they could return to the capital whenever politics demanded it. After all, abandoning Rome completely would have been unthinkable. A senator who vanished for months risked becoming yesterday's news, and in Roman politics, yesterday's news rarely enjoyed tomorrow's influence. The undisputed jewel of coastal living was the Bay of Naples. Sheltered by gentle hills and warmed by a mild climate, it offered breathtaking scenery throughout the year. The towns of Baiae, Puteoli, Herculaneum, Pompeii, and Stabiae became lined with magnificent villas belonging to senators, generals, wealthy merchants, and even emperors themselves. Baiae, in particular, earned a reputation that would have delighted modern travel advertisers. Warm mineral springs bubbled naturally from the earth. Luxurious bathhouses overlooked the sea, lavish gardens stretched toward the shoreline, and private docks welcomed elegant pleasure boats. It was often described as the most fashionable resort in the Roman world. Of course, wherever rich Romans gathered, rumours quickly followed. Ancient writers loved portraying Baiae as a place where fortunes disappeared almost as quickly as self-control. Banquets stretched late into the night. Wine flowed freely. Musicians entertained wealthy guests, and political rivals occasionally found themselves sitting at the same dinner table pretending to enjoy each other's company. Some moralists complained that Baiae softened Roman discipline. Others quietly purchased villas there anyway. Not everyone headed south. Some preferred the quieter coastline around Antium, while others built homes near the hills overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. A few sought the dramatic beauty of Capri, whose towering cliffs offered privacy difficult to find anywhere else. The island later became closely associated with Emperor Tiberius, who spent much of his reign there, governing an empire from a palace that overlooked the endless blue horizon. Natural beauty played an enormous role in choosing these locations. Roman architects carefully positioned villas to capture cooling sea breezes during the scorching summer months. Large windows framed panoramic views of the water, while shaded terraces allowed owners to enjoy long afternoons without baking beneath the Mediterranean sun. Every detail served one purpose: making nature itself part of the architecture. The coast also remained surprisingly practical. Excellent roads connected these retreats to Rome, while the sea offered another convenient highway. Wealthy owners could travel aboard comfortable ships, bringing servants, furniture, artwork, fresh food, and enough luggage to suggest they were relocating an entire household rather than spending a pleasant weekend away. The perfect Roman villa was never built in isolation. It was carefully placed where luxury, convenience, breathtaking scenery, and political necessity met the sea. Finding the perfect stretch of coastline was only the beginning. The real challenge was transforming a rugged hillside or quiet shoreline into a residence worthy of Rome's elite. Fortunately, wealthy Romans were never discouraged by small inconveniences like steep cliffs, unstable ground, or the occasional need to reshape an entire landscape. Construction crews could spend years preparing the site before the villa itself truly emerged. Hillsides were carved into wide terraces, supported by massive stone retaining walls. These artificial platforms created level ground, where elegant homes, gardens and courtyards could overlook the sea. Some estates seemed to float above the coastline, offering uninterrupted views that stretched for miles across shimmering blue water. Roman architects believed a villa should work with nature rather than fight against it. Instead of hiding the surrounding landscape, they designed the house to celebrate it. Long covered walkways connected different wings of the estate. Open courtyards invited sunlight into the centre of the home, while colonnades framed the sea like an enormous living painting. Wherever possible, a guest should catch sight of the water simply by turning a corner. The finest villas featured enormous reception halls for entertaining visitors, private libraries filled with scrolls, elegant dining rooms that opened toward the sea, and bedrooms positioned to catch the cool evening breeze. Floors sparkled with intricate mosaics depicting dolphins, sea gods, fish, or scenes from Greek mythology. Walls were covered with colourful frescoes showing idyllic landscapes that looked remarkably similar to the one just outside the window. Water itself became both decoration and engineering masterpiece. Aqueducts or carefully built cisterns supplied fresh water to fountains, ornamental pools, bath complexes, and lush gardens. Visitors might hear gentle splashing long before they reached the front entrance. It created an atmosphere of constant calm, even during the hottest months of the year. The gardens received just as much attention as the buildings. Cypress trees lined elegant pathways. Roses, lilies, violets, and fragrant herbs filled the air with perfume. Marble statues stood among carefully trimmed hedges, while shaded pergolas provided pleasant places to escape the afternoon sun. Wealthy owners often imported exotic plants from across the empire simply because they could. Some estates became so extravagant that portions extended directly into the sea. Massive concrete foundations, remarkably durable even underwater, allowed owners to build terraces, pavilions, fish ponds, and private harbours that projected beyond the natural shoreline. Roman engineers had mastered hydraulic concrete, making these ambitious waterfront projects entirely possible. Standing on one of these terraces, it could feel as though your home belonged as much to the sea as to the land. Naturally, all this luxury required an army of workers. Architects, stonemasons, painters, gardeners, cooks, cleaners, sailors, and dozens of enslaved labourers kept every fountain flowing and every mosaic gleaming. While the owner admired the sunset with a cup of Falernian wine, hundreds of unseen hands ensured paradise continued running smoothly. The Roman seaside villa was never just a house. It was a carefully engineered masterpiece, built to convince everyone who visited that its owner had mastered not only wealth, but nature itself. Once you arrived at your seaside villa, something remarkable happened. For perhaps the first time in months, your day no longer belonged entirely to Rome. There was no endless stream of clients waiting at your front door before sunrise. No senators eager to debate policy over breakfast. No crowds pressing through the forum, or messengers rushing in with yet another political crisis that absolutely could not wait until tomorrow. Well, most of the time. The Romans even had a word for this carefully cultivated freedom: otium. Today it is often translated as leisure, but that hardly captures its meaning. To an educated Roman, otium meant time spent away from public duties, devoted instead to reading, writing, conversation, philosophy, and quiet reflection. At least that was the respectable explanation. In reality, otium could also involve an exceptionally comfortable chair, excellent seafood, and absolutely no intention of doing anything strenuous before dinner. The day often began slowly. Instead of waking to the thunder of carts on Roman streets, you heard waves rolling against the rocks below your terrace. Servants opened the shutters, allowing cool sea air to drift through the house. Breakfast was simple compared to the elaborate evening meal. Fresh bread, olives, fruit, cheese, honey, and perhaps eggs or leftover fish from the previous day. Afterward came a leisurely walk through the gardens. Wealthy Romans believed gardens were extensions of the home itself, designed not only for beauty but also for peace of mind. Carefully clipped hedges, flowering plants, marble statues, and shaded paths encouraged slow conversation rather than hurried movement. Everything seemed designed to persuade visitors that there was nowhere more urgent to be. Many owners spent part of the morning reading Greek literature or discussing philosophy with friends. Scrolls by Homer, Plato, or Virgil might be read aloud beneath a covered colonnade, while servants quietly poured watered wine. Others dictated letters to secretaries, keeping one cautious eye on events back in Rome. Escaping the capital did not mean ignoring it completely. Politics had an annoying habit of following successful people wherever they went. The afternoon often centered around bathing. Private bath complexes inside the villa rivaled many public baths in the city, complete with heated rooms, warm pools, cold plunges, and massage areas. Afterward, a light meal might be served before owners rested during the hottest hours of the day. The Mediterranean sun had little interest in whether someone was wealthy enough to own several villas. As evening approached, the estate came alive again. Friends arrived by boat or horseback, musicians prepared their instruments, lamps illuminated the gardens, and cooks transformed the day's fresh catch into elegant dishes. Laughter drifted across the water as the sea reflected the last orange glow of sunset. For Rome's elite, these coastal retreats offered something almost impossible to find within the capital itself. Not simply luxury, but the rare feeling that time had finally begun to move at the pace of the tides rather than the demands of an empire. No Roman seaside villa, no matter how beautiful its gardens or breathtaking its view, could truly earn admiration without one essential ingredient: an unforgettable dinner. The evening meal, known as the cena, was the highlight of the day. It was far more than an opportunity to eat. It was a carefully staged performance where wealth, education, hospitality, and social status were all displayed on equal footing with the food itself. If your guests left impressed, you had succeeded. If they left talking about your dinner for the next month, even better. Preparations began long before anyone arrived. Servants polished silver cups until they reflected the afternoon sun. Marble tables were decorated with flowers gathered from the gardens. Oil lamps were arranged to cast a warm glow across painted walls and colourful mosaics. Every detail mattered. Unlike many dining rooms in Rome, those in seaside villas were designed to embrace the landscape. Wide openings overlooked the sea, allowing cool evening breezes to drift inside. As guests reclined on comfortable couches arranged around low tables, they could watch fishing boats returning to shore while waves quietly rolled beneath the cliffs below. It was dining with a view that even modern restaurants would envy. The menu celebrated both the empire and the coast itself. Fresh oysters, mussels, sea bass, mullet, octopus, and lobster appeared alongside roasted meats, cheeses, figs, olives, and baskets of warm bread. Fish often reached the kitchen only hours after being caught. Wealthy owners sometimes maintained their own fish ponds within the estate, ensuring that dinner was as fresh as possible. Naturally, everything received a generous seasoning of garum, Rome's famous fermented fish sauce. It flavoured countless dishes across the empire. Modern noses might hesitate at the description, but Roman diners considered it a mark of refined taste. Like many acquired tastes throughout history, it probably sounded better after several cups of wine. Speaking of wine, it flowed constantly. Servants mixed it with water before serving, as drinking unmixed wine was widely viewed as uncivilized. Throughout the evening, cups were continually refilled while guests toasted victories, friendships, successful business ventures, or simply the fact that they were fortunate enough not to be spending the evening sweating in Rome. Entertainment often accompanied the meal. Musicians played soft melodies on the lyre or flute, while poets recited verses from memory. Skilled dancers performed between courses, and philosophers occasionally joined the conversation, though preferably not the sort who insisted on discussing mortality while everyone was enjoying dessert. Conversation remained just as important as the food. Politics, literature, military campaigns, architecture, philosophy, and the latest scandals all found their place around the table. A clever joke could earn as much admiration as an expensive serving of imported delicacies. Fortunately, Roman politicians supplied an endless source of material. As darkness settled over the coastline, lamps flickered across terraces overlooking the sea. Gentle waves echoed below, while laughter drifted into the warm Mediterranean night. For a few precious hours, surrounded by good company and endless water, the worries of Rome felt wonderfully far away. For all the peace offered by the sea, one thing refused to remain in Rome: work. The wealthy citizens who escaped to their coastal villas often liked to imagine they had left politics, business, and responsibility safely behind the city walls. Reality, however, had other plans. Rome was an empire stretching from Britain to the deserts of Syria, and empires had an inconvenient habit of generating problems every single day. Sooner or later, someone would arrive carrying a scroll. Messengers regularly travelled between Rome and the coastal estates, riding horseback along the great Roman roads, or sailing across calm waters when conditions allowed. They delivered letters from senators, magistrates, family members, business partners, and occasionally the emperor himself. Some messages contained invitations to important meetings. Others carried reports from distant provinces. A few undoubtedly began with the ancient equivalent of, "Sorry to bother you while you're relaxing." Many villa owners remained deeply involved in managing enormous fortunes. Their wealth rarely came from a single source. One senator might own farms producing olive oil in Hispania, vineyards in Campania, rental buildings in Rome, merchant ships crossing the Mediterranean, and mines in the provinces. Keeping track of such an empire required constant correspondence. Fortunately, wealthy Romans employed educated secretaries, many of them highly trained enslaved Greeks, who organised documents, copied letters, maintained financial records, and wrote as their masters dictated. The owner might stroll through a shaded garden discussing philosophy one moment, then spend the next hour issuing instructions about grain shipments, tax collections, or legal disputes hundreds of miles away. The villa itself often functioned as a small administrative centre. Visitors arrived seeking favours or advice. Local officials requested assistance. Business associates negotiated contracts beneath covered porticos, while servants quietly offered wine and fruit. Even in paradise, meetings had an unfortunate tendency to appear. Politics remained impossible to escape entirely. A senator could not simply vanish every summer without consequences. Friendships needed maintaining. Alliances required careful attention. Rivals never took holidays, and neither did ambition. Many owners therefore treated their villas as temporary retreats rather than permanent residences, returning to Rome whenever important debates, elections, or imperial ceremonies demanded their presence. Ironically, some of Rome's biggest decisions were shaped far from the capital itself. Generals discussed military campaigns while overlooking peaceful bays. Wealthy patrons planned marriages between influential families during quiet dinners by the sea. Emperors occasionally governed directly from their villas, proving that even the centre of the world's greatest empire could sometimes shift to wherever its ruler happened to be enjoying the view. The coastline offered escape from Rome's noise, its crowds, and its relentless pace. But it could never completely free its richest citizens from the responsibilities that had made them wealthy enough to build these magnificent villas in the first place. If owning a seaside villa made you wealthy, having the emperor as your neighbour made the coastline the centre of the Roman world. The emperors themselves fell in love with life beside the sea, and wherever they settled, Rome's most ambitious citizens were never far behind. A quiet fishing town could become fashionable almost overnight simply because the ruler of the empire had decided the view was particularly pleasant. No place illustrated this better than Baiae. By the early empire, Baiae had become the ultimate luxury destination. Emperors, senators, victorious generals, and enormously rich merchants all built magnificent residences overlooking its calm waters. Ancient writers described terraces climbing the hillsides, marble villas stretching toward the sea, private harbours crowded with elegant pleasure boats, and bath complexes fed by naturally heated mineral springs bubbling beneath the earth. To wealthy Romans, Baiae represented everything success was supposed to look like. Of course, it also gained a rather colourful reputation. Roman moralists complained endlessly about what happened there. According to authors like Seneca, Baiae encouraged laziness, extravagance, and every imaginable form of excess. Music echoed late into the night. Lavish banquets blurred into lavish parties. Expensive perfumes floated through the air, while brightly painted boats carried fashionable guests across the bay. If an elderly philosopher declared that civilization was collapsing because people were enjoying themselves too much, there was an excellent chance he was talking about Baiae. Not every emperor visited simply for pleasure. Some used their coastal residences as genuine centres of government. Emperor Augustus frequently stayed along the Bay of Naples, combining relaxation with official business. Letters continued arriving, advisors came and went, and important decisions were made with the sea visible through open windows. Then there was Tiberius. Rather than merely vacationing on the coast, he eventually withdrew to the island of Capri. High above the Mediterranean, he constructed an extraordinary palace overlooking towering cliffs and endless water. From there, he ruled the Roman Empire for years. Messengers crossed constantly between Capri and Rome, carrying orders that affected millions of people across 3 continents. Capri's dramatic isolation provided both security and privacy. Visitors could be carefully controlled, while spectacular views reminded everyone that the emperor occupied a position quite literally above the rest of society. Naturally, rumours flourished. Ancient historians filled their pages with sensational stories about Tiberius's final years on Capri. Some accounts are almost certainly exaggerated, written decades later by authors who delighted in scandal as much as accuracy. Separating fact from political gossip remains difficult even today, proving that celebrity rumours are far older than social media. The imperial presence transformed the entire coastline. Roads improved, ports expanded, luxury businesses flourished, and wealthy Romans hurried to build villas nearby. After all, networking became much easier when the emperor's dinner invitation required only a short boat ride instead of a journey across Italy. For Rome's elite, the coast was no longer simply a beautiful retreat. It had quietly become one of the empire's most influential addresses. Nothing, not even the grandest Roman seaside villa, could escape the passage of time. For generations, these magnificent estates stood as symbols of unimaginable wealth. Their gardens bloomed each spring, fountains sparkled beneath the Mediterranean sun, and elegant banquets continued long after their original owners had disappeared from history. Children inherited them, expanded them, and added new wings, fresh mosaics, and larger bathhouses, convinced that their family's paradise would last forever. History, unfortunately, had other plans. The first great blow arrived not from invading armies, but from nature itself. In the year 79 after Christ, Mount Vesuvius erupted with terrifying force. Within hours, ash and volcanic rock buried nearby towns, including Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Stabiae. Many luxurious villas that had overlooked the beautiful Bay of Naples suddenly found themselves beneath meters of volcanic debris. Some owners escaped by sea, while others remained behind, believing the danger would soon pass. It did not. In ancient Egypt, a festival was never just a day off work with better food and fewer complaints from your supervisor. It was a moment when the entire world was believed to lean closer to the gods. For most of the year, the most sacred statues of Egypt's gods remained hidden inside temple sanctuaries. Ordinary people did not simply stroll in to admire Amun, Hathor, Osiris, or Isis, as though visiting a museum with very serious lighting. These divine images lived deep inside the temple, cared for by priests who washed, clothed, perfumed, and fed them through daily rituals. But during the great festivals, everything changed. Temple doors opened. Priests emerged in white linen. Incense drifted into the air. Musicians prepared their drums, rattles, flutes, and sistra, those sacred metal instruments that made a shimmering sound associated especially with goddesses like Hathor. Crowds gathered along streets and riverbanks, waiting for the rare moment when the god would leave the darkness of the sanctuary and travel among the people. The statue itself was usually concealed inside a shrine, carried on a sacred bark by priests. Even hidden, its presence was powerful. To the Egyptians, this was not a symbol being paraded for decoration. This was the god's living power moving through the world, visiting temples, blessing the land, and renewing the bond between heaven and earth. The atmosphere must have been overwhelming. Imagine farmers leaving their fields, craftsmen pausing their work, merchants closing stalls, children pushing through crowds for a better view, and nobles arriving in fine linen as if the whole kingdom had received the same invitation, which, in a sense, it had. The gods did not send personal messages, probably because Papyrus already had enough administrative suffering. These festivals mattered because Egyptian religion was built around balance. The universe depended on Maat, the divine order that kept the Nile flooding, the sun rising, crops growing, and society from collapsing into chaos. Rituals were not empty performances. They were maintenance for creation itself. A festival renewed the strength of the god, the legitimacy of the pharaoh, and the confidence of the people. For ordinary Egyptians, it was also one of the few times they could feel close to the divine world, normally hidden behind temple walls. They might pray, ask questions, bring offerings, sing hymns, drink beer, eat bread, and celebrate beneath banners and sunlight. A festival turned the city into a sacred stage, and for a few dazzling days, Egypt did not simply worship its gods. It watched them pass through the streets. Long before the first drum echoed through the streets, or the sacred procession stepped beyond the temple gates, the festival had already begun, not in the public squares, but behind the towering stone walls of Egypt's temples, where preparations unfolded with remarkable precision. A major religious festival could require weeks of careful planning, involving hundreds of priests, servants, musicians, craftsmen, bakers, brewers, and labourers. Nothing was left to chance. After all, if you were preparing to welcome a god, you did not want to discover at the last minute that someone had forgotten the incense. The priests were among the first to prepare themselves. Unlike the general population, temple priests followed strict rules of ritual purity before important ceremonies. They shaved their heads and bodies to remove every trace of impurity, bathed several times each day in sacred water, and washed their mouths with natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt used throughout Egypt for cleansing. Linen garments were freshly laundered, as wool was considered unsuitable for sacred rituals because it came from animals. The temple itself also underwent a transformation. Stone floors were swept spotless. Sacred halls were washed. Statues were polished, shrines repaired, and colourful banners hung throughout the courtyards. The scent of myrrh, frankincense, and kaifi, one of Egypt's most famous temple perfumes, drifted through the air as incense burners were tested for the coming ceremonies. Meanwhile, workshops buzzed with activity. Goldsmiths inspected ceremonial jewellery. Carpenters repaired the wooden carrying poles that supported the sacred barks. Scribes carefully reviewed ritual texts that had been recited for centuries. Musicians rehearsed hymns dedicated to the gods, ensuring every note matched traditions passed down through generations. Even experienced performers practiced repeatedly. Apparently, forgetting the lyrics while singing for Amun was considered slightly more embarrassing than forgetting them at a family gathering. Outside the temple, ordinary Egyptians prepared in their own ways. Families baked extra loaves of bread, brewed fresh beer, and cleaned their homes before the celebrations began. Many planned journeys from nearby villages, hoping to witness the procession with their own eyes. Merchants filled their stalls with food, pottery, jewellery, and small religious amulets, knowing thousands of visitors would soon flood the city. The pharaoh also played an essential role. Although he could not attend every festival across Egypt, he remained the chief intermediary between the gods and humanity. During the greatest celebrations, especially those held at major temples like Karnak or Luxor, the king either appeared in person or was represented through official ceremonies performed in his name. His presence reinforced the belief that Egypt's prosperity depended upon cooperation between the gods and their earthly ruler. As anticipation spread throughout the kingdom, excitement grew with each passing day. Everyone knew that soon the temple doors would open, the sacred shrines would emerge into the sunlight, and the gods themselves would begin their journey among the people. At last, the morning arrived. Before sunrise, the temple was already awake. Priests moved silently through its dimly lit halls carrying oil lamps, whose flames danced across towering columns carved with hieroglyphs. The smell of incense filled the air, mixing with the fragrance of fresh flowers that decorated the inner sanctuary. Outside the massive gates, however, silence had given way to anticipation. Thousands of people waited. Families had travelled from villages along the Nile. some arriving the evening before to secure a good place along the route. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Merchants squeezed between the crowds selling bread, dates, beer, and small amulets bearing the likenesses of the gods. Soldiers stood watch to keep the growing masses orderly, though excitement was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. Then the temple doors opened. A wave of chanting drifted into the streets. Musicians stepped forward first. Drummers established a slow, steady rhythm, while trumpets announced the beginning of the ceremony. Women shook bronze sistra, producing a bright metallic sound believed to please the gods, particularly Hathor. Flutes added gentle melodies that echoed against the temple walls as hymns filled the morning air. Behind them came the priests, dressed in spotless white linen. They walked barefoot as a sign of ritual purity. Some carried burning incense that sent thick clouds of sweet-smelling smoke into the sky. Others held sacred standards topped with symbols representing different gods, temple districts, or royal authority. Every movement followed traditions that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. Finally, the most important moment arrived. The sacred shrine emerged from the temple. Hidden inside was the statue of the god, invisible to almost everyone watching. The divine image rested within an elaborate wooden shrine covered in gold leaf and precious decorations. This shrine was mounted upon a ceremonial bark, complete with a curved prow and stern like a miniature boat. Long wooden poles extended from either side, allowing teams of priests to carry the entire structure upon their shoulders. The crowd erupted with joy. Many Egyptians raised their hands in prayer. Others bowed their heads as the shrine passed. Some called out personal requests for health, successful harvests, healthy children, or protection for their families. To them, this was not simply a religious parade. Their god had left the sanctuary to walk among the people, bringing divine blessings beyond the temple walls. The procession moved slowly through carefully planned routes connecting temples, shrines, and sacred landmarks. At intervals, the priests paused so offerings of bread, fruit, flowers, wine, and incense could be presented before continuing onward. Every stop carried religious significance, symbolizing ancient myths or reaffirming the relationship between the gods, the pharaoh, and Egypt itself. For a few extraordinary hours, the boundary between heaven and earth seemed to disappear. The gods were no longer hidden behind stone walls. They were travelling through the heart of Egypt itself. Although the procession through the streets was breathtaking, its most magnificent moment often came when it reached the Nile. To the ancient Egyptians, the river was far more than a source of water. It was the lifeblood of the kingdom, the highway that connected every major city, and a divine gift that made civilization itself possible. It fed the fields, carried merchants and soldiers, and, during the great festivals, became the ceremonial road upon which the gods themselves travelled. The sacred bark was at the heart of this journey. Inside the temple, the portable shrine carrying the god was designed to resemble a beautifully crafted boat. During river festivals, however, this shrine was carefully transferred onto an actual ceremonial vessel waiting at the water's edge. These magnificent boats were unlike ordinary fishing craft. Their hulls gleamed with brightly painted wood, while gilded decorations caught the sunlight, making the vessel appear almost to glow as it floated across the river. Many featured elaborate carvings of falcons, cobras, lotus flowers, or papyrus plants. Some displayed golden ram's heads for Amun, or cow horns for Hathor, immediately revealing which deity was making the voyage. Colourful linen canopies shaded the sacred shrine at the centre of the boat, ensuring that the god remained protected throughout the journey. Only selected priests could approach the divine image. Most Egyptians never actually saw the statue itself. It remained hidden within its shrine behind curtains or doors, preserving its mystery and holiness. Yet no one doubted the god's presence. As the vessel slowly departed the shore, thousands of people raised their hands in greeting, believing their prayers could reach the deity as it passed. The riverbanks became enormous viewing platforms. Families crowded every available space. Farmers paused their work along the fields to watch the procession glide past. Small boats followed at a respectful distance, filled with musicians, temple officials, and curious spectators hoping for a closer glimpse. Children waved branches of palm and papyrus, while adults sang hymns that echoed across the water. One of the most famous examples was the beautiful festival of the valley at Thebes. During this annual celebration, the god Amun left the great temple of Karnak aboard his sacred bark and crossed the Nile to visit temples and royal mortuary complexes on the western bank. The journey symbolized far more than simple travel. It connected the worlds of the living and the dead, allowing both communities to participate in the blessings of the festival. The voyage itself was slow and deeply ceremonial. Priests stopped at designated shrines where fresh offerings of bread, beer, fruit, flowers, and incense were presented. Musicians continued playing, while chants rose above the gentle splash of oars. Every movement followed rituals that had been repeated for centuries, each one believed to help preserve the divine order of the universe. As the sacred vessel drifted across the shimmering Nile beneath Egypt's brilliant sun, it created a scene unlike anything else in the ancient world. For the people watching from the shore, it was not simply a beautiful boat, it was the gods sailing through their own kingdom. Once the sacred procession had returned to the temple, and the gods had received their offerings, the mood of the festival shifted. The solemn chants gave way to joyful celebration. For ordinary Egyptians, this was often the moment they had been waiting for. Religious devotion remained at the heart of every festival, but the gods were believed to delight in happiness as much as reverence. A successful celebration honoured the divine not through silence alone, but through music, laughter, generous feasting, and communities gathering together in peace. The temples had prepared for this moment for weeks. Egypt's great temples owned enormous estates filled with farmland, vineyards, orchards, fisheries, and herds of cattle. These vast resources supplied thousands of loaves of bread, countless jars of beer, fresh vegetables, dates, figs, onions, roasted ducks, geese, beef, and fish. During many major festivals, large portions of these offerings were redistributed among the people after they had first been presented to the gods. Receiving food from the temple was more than simply enjoying a free meal. The offerings had become blessed through their presentation before the deity. Eating them symbolized sharing in the favor of the gods themselves. Every loaf of bread and every cup of beer carried both nourishment and spiritual meaning. Naturally, enormous crowds gathered. Families spread woven mats beneath palm trees, while children ran between groups carrying fresh fruit or small cakes sweetened with honey. Merchants did excellent business selling additional treats, jewellery, perfumes, and colourful linen clothing. The atmosphere resembled a great fair as much as a religious ceremony. Beer flowed generously throughout the celebrations. Unlike modern beer, Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and often consumed daily by people of every social class. During festivals, however, larger quantities appeared than usual. Fortunately, Egyptian celebrations demonstrated that people have always possessed the remarkable historical ability to become louder after several drinks, regardless of which millennium they happen to occupy. Music never seemed to stop. Professional musicians played harps, lutes, flutes, drums, and the shimmering sistrum from morning until evening. Groups of singers performed hymns praising the gods, while dancers entertained crowds with graceful movements accompanied by rhythmic clapping. Some performers were attached permanently to the temples, spending years mastering ceremonies that had changed little over generations. The festivals also brought together people who rarely met during ordinary life. Farmers from distant villages stood beside wealthy officials from the royal administration. Skilled craftsmen, fishermen, scribes, soldiers and merchants all shared the same streets and celebrations. For a brief time, much of Egyptian society gathered around a common purpose that crossed social boundaries. As the sun slowly descended toward the western desert, the celebrations continued beneath rows of flickering oil lamps. Laughter echoed through the temple courtyards. Musicians played well into the evening, and the scent of roasted meat and incense drifted together through the warm air. For a few extraordinary days each year, Egypt was not only united by its pharaoh, it was united by the shared joy of celebrating its gods. No matter which god the people had gathered to honour, one figure always stood at the centre of every great Egyptian festival: the pharaoh. To modern eyes, he may seem like simply a king dressed in magnificent robes and an impressive collection of crowns. To the ancient Egyptians, however, the pharaoh was something far greater. He was the living link between humanity and the gods, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the divine balance that kept the Nile flowing, the sun rising, and Egypt prosperous. Every major festival reaffirmed that sacred responsibility. When the pharaoh appeared in public during these celebrations, it was a spectacle unlike any other. His arrival was announced long before he came into view. Soldiers cleared the ceremonial route, while officials hurried into position. Standard bearers carried brightly coloured banners embroidered with royal symbols. Fan bearers shaded the king with enormous ostrich feather fans, while musicians filled the air with triumphant melodies played on long silver trumpets and deep ceremonial drums. The crowd erupted with cheers. Many people had never seen the ruler with their own eyes. For villagers who had travelled days along the Nile, catching even a brief glimpse of the pharaoh was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Some knelt as he passed. Others raised their hands in blessing, or shouted prayers for the king's long life and Egypt's continued prosperity. The pharaoh himself wore clothing reserved for sacred ceremonies. Fresh white linen symbolized purity, while elaborate jewelry crafted from gold, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and carnelian reflected the sunlight brilliantly. Depending on the occasion, he might wear the white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt, or the famous double crown representing the union of both lands. Around his neck rested broad jewelled collars, while in his hands he carried the crook and flail, ancient symbols of kingship that reminded everyone he ruled both as protector and provider. His role during the festival extended far beyond simply making an appearance. Inside the temple, the pharaoh offered incense, wine, bread, flowers, and precious oils before the gods. Temple reliefs carved into stone walls often show the king presenting elaborate gifts to deities like Amun, Ra, Horus, or Osiris. These scenes were more than artistic decoration. Egyptians believed the rituals genuinely nourished the gods and renewed the harmony of the universe. Interestingly, the ordinary crowd rarely witnessed these sacred moments directly. The holiest rituals took place deep within the temple sanctuary, where only priests and the pharaoh could enter. What the public saw instead were the processions, ceremonies, and celebrations that surrounded these private acts of worship. Yet everyone understood what was happening behind the temple walls. If the king fulfilled his sacred duties correctly, Egypt itself would flourish. The Nile would flood at the proper time. Crops would grow. The gods would remain favourable. The kingdom would continue in peace. In every grand festival, the Egyptians celebrated their gods. But they also celebrated the man they believed had been chosen to stand beside them. Among all the magnificent celebrations held in ancient Egypt, none better demonstrated the power of religion, royalty, and spectacle than the festival of Opet. Held each year in the city of Thebes, the festival honoured Amun, the king of the gods, along with his divine family, Mut and Khonsu. But beneath the music, processions and celebrations lay a deeper purpose. Opet was not simply about honouring the gods, it was about renewing the pharaoh himself. To the Egyptians, even a mighty ruler required divine approval. Without the blessing of Amun, the pharaoh was simply another man. During Opet, the god symbolically renewed the king's right to rule, reminding the entire kingdom that royal authority came directly from the heavens. The celebration began at the vast temple of Karnak. Hidden inside richly decorated shrines, the statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were carefully placed upon their sacred barks. Priests lifted the heavy vessels onto their shoulders as musicians struck up triumphant melodies. Clouds of incense drifted toward the towering pylons, while thousands of spectators packed every available space around the temple. The procession slowly made its way toward Luxor Temple, nearly 3 kilometers away. Sometimes the journey followed an avenue lined with hundreds of ram-headed sphinxes, each silently watching the sacred parade pass. On other occasions, particularly during later periods, the divine barks travelled by boat along the Nile before reaching Luxor. Whether on land or water, the spectacle inspired awe throughout the city. The streets became a sea of celebration. People sang hymns dedicated to Amun. Children climbed onto walls and rooftops for a better view. Priests chanted ancient prayers, while temple dancers performed graceful rituals accompanied by harps, flutes, drums, and shimmering sistra. Every few moments the procession paused so offerings could be presented or ceremonies performed. The festival itself could last for days and, under some pharaohs, nearly a month. Imagine an entire city celebrating for weeks. Even modern holiday planners might politely suggest everyone take a short nap somewhere around day 12. When the procession finally reached Luxor Temple, the most sacred ceremonies took place behind closed doors. Only the highest-ranking priests and the pharaoh entered the inner sanctuary. There, hidden from public view, mysterious rituals reaffirmed the divine relationship between Amun and the king. Exactly what occurred remains uncertain, as many ceremonies were deliberately kept secret. That mystery only strengthened the festival's sacred reputation. Outside, however, the celebrations never stopped. The crowds continued feasting, drinking beer, listening to musicians, and filling the streets with laughter while they waited for the gods to emerge once more. When the sacred barks finally began their return to Karnak, the message was clear. The gods had once again blessed Egypt. The pharaoh's rule had been renewed, and the kingdom could look forward to another year under the protection of both heaven and the Nile. Not every Egyptian festival was filled only with music, dancing, and grand processions through crowded streets. Some celebrations carried people somewhere quieter. Across the Nile, beyond the fertile fields, and into the great cemeteries where generations of Egyptians rested beneath the desert sands. To the ancient Egyptians, death was never considered the end of life. It was simply another stage of existence. The dead continued living in the afterlife, provided they were remembered, honoured, and supplied with offerings from the world of the living. Festivals gave families the perfect opportunity to strengthen that connection. One of the most beloved was the beautiful Festival of the Valley. Each year, after the sacred bark of Amun crossed the Nile from Karnak, the god visited the temples and royal tombs on the western bank of Thebes. This was no ordinary journey. The west was where the sun disappeared each evening, making it the symbolic land of the dead. As Amun entered this sacred landscape, he brought blessings not only to the living, but also to those who had already passed into eternity. Families eagerly followed. Entire households crossed the river, carrying baskets filled with bread, beer, fruit, flowers, roasted meat, cakes, and jars of wine. They visited the tombs of parents, grandparents, spouses, and children, cleaning the entrances and decorating them with fresh garlands of lotus blossoms. Incense burned beside offering tables while prayers were spoken aloud, ensuring that the spirits of loved ones continued to receive nourishment in the next world. Rather than mourning, many families treated the occasion as a joyful reunion. Before the rise of classical Greece, before Athens built the Parthenon or Sparta trained its famous warriors, another civilization was already flourishing in the middle of the Mediterranean. On the island of Crete, surrounded by brilliant blue water, the Minoans created one of Europe's earliest great civilizations. Their palaces were filled with colourful frescoes. Their merchants sailed hundreds of miles across open seas, and their artists produced works so lively that they still seem to move nearly 4,000 years later. Yet among all the dolphins, fish, shells, and sea plants decorating their world, one creature appears again and again. The octopus. It curls around elegant pottery. It stretches across palace walls. Its twisting tentacles wrap themselves around jars, cups, and vases with remarkable confidence, almost as if the artist simply allowed the animal to wander freely across the surface. Looking at enough Minoan art, you begin to suspect the octopus had an exceptionally successful public relations campaign. Why this fascination? Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Minoans left us no readable historical records explaining their beliefs. Their writing system, known today as Linear A, has never been fully deciphered. We can admire their artwork, excavate their cities, and study their objects, but the artists themselves remain frustratingly silent. They left us pictures instead of explanations. One thing, however, is immediately obvious. The sea shaped every aspect of Minoan life. Crete sits at the crossroads of the eastern Mediterranean, perfectly positioned between mainland Greece, Egypt, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Near East. Rather than viewing the sea as a dangerous barrier, the Minoans treated it as a highway. Their ships carried olive oil, wine, pottery, textiles, and finely crafted goods across hundreds of kilometres, bringing back copper, ivory, precious stones, and ideas from distant civilizations. Every morning, fishermen launched their boats into calm coastal waters, while merchant vessels prepared for longer journeys. Harbours buzzed with activity as sailors repaired ropes, loaded cargo, and studied the changing winds. Children grew up watching ships disappear over the horizon, knowing they would eventually return carrying stories from lands they had never seen. Life inland was never truly separated from the coast. Even the great palace of Knossos, several kilometres from the shoreline, was deeply connected to maritime trade. Wealth flowed inland from the ports, filling storerooms with imported treasures and giving artists access to pigments, materials, and inspiration from across the Mediterranean. Perhaps that explains why Minoan art feels so different from that of many neighbouring civilizations. While others often celebrated kings marching to war or rulers towering over defeated enemies, Minoan artists looked toward the sea. They painted creatures in motion, captured the rhythm of waves, and filled their world with life rather than conquest. And no creature embodied that living, flowing world more perfectly than the octopus, whose graceful tentacles would become the unmistakable signature of an entire civilization. Once archaeologists began uncovering the buried palaces and towns of ancient Crete, they noticed something impossible to ignore. The octopus was everywhere. It appeared on elegant wine jugs, storage jars, pouring vessels, drinking cups, and delicate flasks, no larger than a modern coffee mug. It stretched across pottery with such confidence that its tentacles often reached from one side of the vessel to the other, wrapping around curved surfaces as though the animal itself had decided to explore the clay. This artistic style became so distinctive that archaeologists eventually gave it a name, the marine style. It flourished during the late Minoan period, around the 16th and 15th centuries before Christ, and remains one of the greatest achievements of Bronze Age art. Unlike earlier pottery, which relied heavily on repeating geometric patterns and orderly designs, marine-style pottery seemed alive. Every creature appeared to swim, twist, drift, or float naturally across the surface. The octopus quickly became its undisputed star. What made these designs so remarkable was their realism. The artists clearly understood how octopuses actually moved beneath the sea. Rather than drawing stiff, symmetrical animals, they painted bodies that curved naturally, while tentacles stretched independently in every direction. Some curled around handles, others disappeared behind the vessel before emerging again on the opposite side. The shape of the pot itself became part of the artwork, allowing the octopus to embrace the object almost like a living creature. It was an astonishingly modern approach to design. Creating these masterpieces required extraordinary skill. First, potters carefully shaped the clay using fast-spinning wheels, producing remarkably thin and balanced vessels. After the pottery dried to the correct consistency, painters applied dark mineral pigments with fine brushes. Every tentacle had to be planned carefully because mistakes were almost impossible to erase. One poorly placed arm, and your magnificent sea creature suddenly resembled an extremely confused piece of seaweed. Fortunately for history, most Minoan artists seem to have avoided that problem. The octopus rarely appeared alone. Swimming beside it were dolphins, flying fish, nautilus shells, sea urchins, starfish, coral, and delicate marine plants. Empty spaces were filled with curling seaweed or graceful spirals, creating compositions that never felt crowded despite their complexity. Everything flowed together with remarkable harmony, as though the entire underwater world had been captured during a single peaceful moment. Interestingly, no two octopuses are exactly alike. Each artist introduced subtle differences in posture, movement, and arrangement. Some animals spread their arms dramatically across the entire vessel, while others appeared calm and compact. This individuality suggests that Minoan painters valued creativity rather than simply copying standard templates. Today, these vessels sit behind museum glass, admired by millions of visitors. Yet it is easy to forget that they were once ordinary household objects used to pour wine, store oil, or serve food. The Minoans transformed everyday pottery into moving works of art, proving that even an ordinary storage jar could become a celebration of the sea. The octopus did not remain confined to pottery. Step inside a Minoan palace, and you quickly discover that the sea had climbed the walls as well. The greatest example is the Palace of Knossos, the largest and most famous centre of Minoan civilization. Although earthquakes, fires, and thousands of years have reduced much of it to ruins, enough survives to reveal an extraordinary world of colour. Walking through its halls would not have felt like entering a dark stone fortress. Instead, it was more like stepping into an enormous work of art. Nearly every important room was decorated. Walls burst with reds, blues, whites, blacks, and yellows. Dolphins leaped across plaster surfaces. Fish darted between strands of seaweed. Shells, lilies, monkeys, birds, and mythical creatures appeared alongside human figures dressed in elegant clothing. The entire palace seemed alive with movement. Although complete octopus frescoes are rarer than the famous pottery, marine life dominated many painted scenes, reminding everyone that the sea was never far away. Creating these frescoes demanded remarkable craftsmanship. Artists first spread a layer of fresh lime plaster across the wall. Before it dried, they carefully applied pigments made from natural minerals. Red came from iron oxide, black from charcoal or manganese, white from lime, while brilliant blue, one of the most striking colours in Minoan art, was produced using a rare synthetic pigment known today as Egyptian blue. Because the paint bonded with the wet plaster, the colours became incredibly durable. The challenge was timing. Once the plaster began to dry, there was no opportunity to pause and continue tomorrow. Painters had to work confidently and quickly, completing each section before the wall hardened. One misjudged brushstroke could mean scraping away the plaster and beginning the entire area again. Ancient deadlines were apparently just as unforgiving as modern ones. The style itself feels surprisingly fresh. Unlike the rigid profile figures common in Egyptian art, many Minoan paintings overflow with energy. Dolphins twist through the water. Fish swim in different directions. Plants bend naturally as though moved by underwater currents. Even human figures appear athletic and graceful, caught in moments of motion rather than frozen poses. The famous dolphin fresco perfectly captures this spirit. Several dolphins glide effortlessly through schools of colourful fish, transforming an ordinary room into an underwater landscape. Whether the original occupants were conducting business, receiving guests, or simply walking through the palace, they were constantly surrounded by reminders of the sea that sustained their civilization. This artistic choice reveals something important. The Minoans did not separate nature from architecture. Instead of covering their walls with scenes of military victories or rulers crushing enemies, they invited the outside world indoors. Marine life became part of everyday existence, softening palace interiors with beauty and movement. For the people of Bronze Age Crete, the sea was not merely beyond the palace walls. It flowed through them. By now, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Why the octopus? The Minoans painted dolphins, fish, shells, seaweed, and countless other creatures from the Mediterranean. Yet none appeared with the same frequency or artistic freedom as the octopus. Its twisting arms stretched across pottery, filled decorative spaces, and became one of the defining images of an entire civilization. Unfortunately, the Minoans never left us an explanation. Their writing system, Linear A, remains undeciphered, meaning the artists themselves cannot tell us why they returned to this remarkable animal again and again. Archaeologists are therefore left doing what historians often do best, making careful observations while resisting the temptation to invent answers that sound wonderfully dramatic. Still, several fascinating possibilities exist. The first is simply beauty. An octopus is unlike almost any other sea creature. Fish swim in fairly predictable lines. Dolphins leap gracefully through the water. But an octopus seems almost to dance. Its 8 arms move independently, curling, stretching, and drifting in every direction at once. Watching one glide across the seabed is less like observing an animal, and more like watching water itself come alive. That flowing movement matched the Minoan artistic style perfectly. Unlike many Bronze Age civilizations that preferred order and symmetry, Minoan artists celebrated curves, motion, and natural forms. The octopus allowed them to fill every corner of a vase without making the design feel crowded. Each tentacle could wrap around the vessel differently, turning even the shape of the pottery into part of the composition. Then there was the creature itself. Modern science has revealed that octopuses are among the most intelligent animals in the ocean. They solve problems, escape enclosures, recognize patterns, and even use tools. The Minoans could not have known all of this, of course, but experienced fishermen certainly understood that octopuses were unusually clever and difficult to catch. Their ability to change colour may also have captured the imagination. An octopus can alter both its colour and the texture of its skin within moments, blending almost perfectly into rocks, sand or coral. To ancient observers, such transformations must have seemed almost magical. A creature that appeared one moment and vanished the next naturally inspired curiosity. Some scholars believe the octopus may even have carried symbolic meaning. Its 8 spreading arms could represent abundance, the reach of the sea, or the interconnected nature of the Mediterranean world that sustained Minoan trade. Others suggest it simply reflected the importance of fishing and everyday coastal life. The truth is that we cannot say with certainty, and perhaps that uncertainty makes the image even more intriguing. One thing, however, is beyond doubt. The Minoans did not paint the octopus because it was frightening. Unlike later civilizations that often celebrated dangerous beasts or mighty warriors, they seemed captivated by elegance rather than power. The octopus became a symbol of movement, curiosity, and the endless rhythms of the sea itself. 4,000 years later, its silent dance across Minoan pottery still asks the same unanswered question. What did the artists see that we are still trying to understand? The Minoans did not simply admire the sea, they mastered it. While many Bronze Age civilizations looked inward toward rivers and fertile plains, the people of Crete looked outward across the Mediterranean. The sea was not a barrier separating them from distant lands. It was the road that connected them to the world. Every harbour on the island buzzed with activity. Merchant ships arrived carrying copper from Cyprus, gold from Egypt, ivory from Africa, tin from distant trading networks, and precious stones from the Near East. In return, Minoan sailors exported fine pottery, olive oil, wine, textiles, perfumes, and beautifully crafted luxury goods. Their influence reached mainland Greece, the Cycladic Islands, Anatolia, the Levant, and even the great kingdoms along the Nile. For a civilization living almost entirely by the sea, marine life became impossible to separate from daily existence. Children grew up watching fishermen untangle their nets before sunrise. Sailors learned to read the wind, the currents, and the changing colour of the water. Harbour workers loaded ships with enormous clay storage jars, while merchants negotiated prices in several different languages. Every successful voyage brought wealth back to Crete, and every departing ship carried a small piece of Minoan culture across the Mediterranean. The octopus naturally became part of this maritime world. Fishermen caught them in rocky coves around the island, where octopuses hid inside crevices or beneath stones during the day. Even today, the waters surrounding Crete remain home to large populations of these remarkable animals. Bronze Age sailors almost certainly encountered them regularly while diving, fishing, or gathering shellfish along the coast. Unlike mythical creatures, the octopus belonged to everyday life. Perhaps that is why Minoan artists painted it with such confidence. They understood its shape, its movement, and its behaviour because they had actually seen it beneath the clear Mediterranean water. Their artwork feels less like fantasy and more like careful observation. Some historians have even suggested that the sea itself became central to Minoan identity. Unlike Egypt, whose civilization revolved around the Nile, or Mesopotamia, which depended upon great rivers, Crete relied on ships. Prosperity arrived by sail. New ideas arrived by sail. Foreign visitors arrived by sail. Even news from distant kingdoms crossed the water long before it reached inland civilizations. The sea offered opportunities, but it also demanded respect. Storms could appear with little warning. Strong winds might delay voyages for days. Navigation depended upon experience, the stars, familiar coastlines, and generations of accumulated knowledge. There were no compasses, no accurate maps, and certainly no helpful voice announcing, "Recalculating route." Yet somehow, the Minoans built one of the greatest trading networks of the Bronze Age. Their ships stitched together distant civilizations, carrying not only goods, but also artistic ideas, technologies, and cultural traditions. Perhaps that is why their artists filled their palaces and pottery with creatures of the sea. For the Minoans, the Mediterranean was not merely where they lived, it was who they were. The octopus may have become the star of Minoan art, but behind every graceful tentacle stood a remarkably skilled human hand. The artists of Bronze Age Crete rarely signed their work. Unlike later Greek sculptors or Renaissance painters, they left no names carved into stone or painted onto pottery. We do not know who created the famous marine-style vases or decorated the palace walls of Knossos, yet their anonymous craftsmanship has survived nearly 4,000 years, quietly outliving the names of many kings. Their workshops were places of constant activity. Potters, painters, sculptors, metal workers, and seal engravers often worked side by side, each specializing in different crafts while sharing techniques and ideas. Apprentices likely began as children, spending years preparing clay, grinding pigments, gathering firewood for kilns, and observing experienced masters before ever being trusted with a brush. Patience was perhaps the most valuable tool in the workshop. Everything began with clay. Crete possessed excellent natural clay deposits, but raw clay could not simply be shaped immediately. It first had to be cleaned of stones and plant material, mixed carefully with water, and kneaded until it reached the perfect consistency. Too wet, and the vessel would collapse. Too dry, and it might crack before reaching the kiln. Once prepared, the clay met the potter's wheel. The Minoans had mastered fast wheel pottery, allowing craftsmen to produce remarkably thin and elegant vessels. Watching an experienced potter must have seemed almost magical. Within minutes, an ordinary lump of earth transformed into a perfectly balanced amphora, jug, or cup beneath steady hands that had repeated the same movements thousands of times. Only after the vessel dried slightly could the painter begin. Using brushes made from plant fibers or animal hair, artists applied mineral-based slips that would turn deep brown or black during firing. Every octopus had to be painted with remarkable confidence. There was little room for hesitation. A single awkward line could spoil the flowing movement that defined marine-style pottery. Perhaps most impressive is the freedom these artists allowed themselves. Ancient Egyptian painters followed strict artistic rules that changed very little over centuries. Human figures appeared in carefully prescribed poses, with heads in profile and shoulders facing forward. Minoan artists, by contrast, seemed far less interested in rigid formulas. Their sea creatures twist naturally, dolphins leap through waves, lilies bend in the wind, and octopuses stretch wherever the shape of the vessel invites them. Even their colours reflected careful experimentation. Red, white, black, yellow, and brilliant blue pigments came from carefully prepared minerals. Fresco painters worked rapidly onto wet plaster before it hardened, while potters relied on precisely controlled kiln temperatures to achieve the rich contrasts that still amaze museum visitors today. The result was art unlike anything else in the Bronze Age. It combined technical precision with remarkable imagination, proving that the Minoans were not simply talented craftsmen. They were artists who understood that the greatest designs are those that feel alive. As remarkable as the octopus was, it was never alone. Look closely at Minoan art, and you enter an entire underwater world. Dolphins leap joyfully across palace walls. flying fish skim above painted waves. Nautilus shells curl into perfect spirals. Starfish spread across pottery, while delicate seaweed sways between coral and drifting marine plants. Every surface seems alive with movement. It is almost as though the artists wanted to bring the Mediterranean indoors. The famous dolphin fresco from Knossos remains one of the finest examples. Bright blue dolphins swim effortlessly among schools of small fish, transforming what may have been a royal apartment into an underwater paradise. Unlike many ancient palace decorations, there are no scenes of frightened prisoners, conquered enemies, or triumphant kings standing over defeated armies. Instead, there are dolphins. It is a striking difference. Throughout much of the Bronze Age, powerful kingdoms often celebrated military victories. Egyptian temples displayed pharaohs crushing foreign enemies beneath their chariots. Assyrian palaces, centuries later, would feature lions being hunted by kings. Warfare became a favourite subject for royal art. The Minoans chose something entirely different. Their greatest masterpieces celebrate nature. This does not mean the Minoans never fought. Every civilization of the Bronze Age understood conflict, and archaeological evidence suggests that weapons certainly existed on Crete. Yet warfare occupies surprisingly little space in their surviving art. Instead, artists preferred flowers, birds, landscapes, athletes, and above all, the sea. Even the plants seem full of energy. Lilies bend naturally in the breeze. Crocuses bloom across rocky hillsides. Papyrus plants rise beside flowing water. Nothing appears stiff or perfectly symmetrical. Every leaf and flower feels as though it has been observed directly from nature rather than copied from an artistic rulebook. The same natural rhythm appears in their depictions of animals. Birds stretch their wings in flight. Goats climb rocky cliffs with remarkable confidence. Dolphins twist playfully through the water. Even the octopus never appears frozen. Its tentacles flow outward in every direction, creating the impression that it might continue swimming at any moment. Modern archaeologists often describe this quality as movement. Rather than arranging every object into rigid rows, Minoan artists created balanced compositions that appear spontaneous. Empty spaces are carefully filled with curling seaweed, shells, or small fish, allowing the viewer's eye to wander naturally across the artwork without ever becoming bored. This artistic philosophy may reveal something deeper about Minoan society. Living on an island surrounded by constantly shifting waves, changing winds, and seasonal voyages, they understood that nature was never static. The sea was always moving, and their art reflected that same endless rhythm. Perhaps that is why Minoan paintings still feel surprisingly modern today. They do not simply show nature, they capture its energy. Nearly 4,000 years later, their dolphins still seem ready to leap. Their lilies still sway in an invisible breeze. And somewhere across a beautifully painted vase, an octopus is still quietly making its way through the Mediterranean. For centuries, the Minoans seemed unstoppable. Their ships crossed the Mediterranean, their palaces expanded, and their artists continued filling walls and pottery with the graceful creatures of the sea. Crete had become one of the richest islands in the Bronze Age, admired by its neighbours and connected to nearly every major civilization around it. Then, quite suddenly, that vibrant world began to change. No single disaster destroyed the Minoan civilization overnight. Instead, a series of events slowly unravelled the prosperous society that had produced some of history's most beautiful art. Nature struck first. Crete sits in one of the most active earthquake zones in the Mediterranean, and powerful tremors regularly shook the island. Archaeologists have found evidence that several great palaces, including Knossos, Hephaistos and Malea suffered repeated earthquake damage over the centuries. Walls collapsed, staircases cracked, and entire sections of buildings had to be rebuilt.